Great. Thank you very much, Emily, for that generous introduction and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to present some of my current research. I've just finished the first draft of a book manuscript on the history of area studies and Middle East studies in the United States. And at this stage, I look forward to and really need your feedback on some of the key arguments that I'm trying to make in this book. In fact, this is going to be something of a big picture book talk in which I'll try to lay out some of the broader arguments and themes of the work rather than a more narrowly focused paper. I'll begin by explaining what this research project is about and what it came out of. And I hope that after I'm done talking, we can go more deeply into whatever I didn't get around to talking about or whatever you might find of particular interest. So one way to frame what I'm trying to do in this project is to pose this question. How did it come about that here we are gathered under the auspices of not of a disciplinary department of a major research university, but under the auspices of an entity called the Center for Middle Eastern Studies with a geographic rather than a disciplinary focus. This kind of entity on the American academic scene would barely have been imaginable 75 years ago, which for a historian is sort of like yesterday. In other words, where did Middle East studies and the other area studies fields that have become apparently durable features of the academic scene in the United States come from? What made their emergence possible? What shaped their trajectories? And how did they actually get built as academic fields? And these are some of the questions I've tried to explore. Now, as Emily mentioned, and as some of you may know, in 2004 I published a book titled Contending Visions of the Middle East, The History and Politics of Orientalism. And a good part of that book addressed the linkages between the power which the United States has exercised in the Middle East and the Muslim world since the Second World War on the one hand, and on the other, the knowledge produced about those regions in this country. So in that context, I discussed the emergence and evolution of Middle East studies from the end of the Second World War, roughly, to the near present. And I tried to delineate what I call that field's politics of knowledge, along with the transformations that it underwent over that period. That overview in that book included some discussion of the origins of area studies, but its main concern was the emergence and development of U.S. Middle East studies, and especially the field's intellectual trajectory, including its engagements with Orientalism and with modernization theory in the 1950s and 1960s, and the critiques of those paradigms that made themselves increasingly felt from the 1970s onward. My account of the history of Middle East studies in that book was based largely on secondary sources and on analyses of specific texts, which I took as emblematic of certain characteristics of some of the scholarly writing in the Middle East and the Muslim world at particular points in time. Now, I've never claimed that that book was the last word on the subject, but I think the big picture it laid out was more or less accurate. On the other hand, in the years since writing that book, I've become increasingly aware that we actually still know very little about many dimensions of the history of this field and of the context that gave birth to it and helped shape it. And that realization led me to head for the archives to do more research, and on that basis work on writing a book that I see as very different in purpose and focus and scope than Contending Visions. So over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time working in the archives of the Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford Foundations, the Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, among other entities. And my goal has been to explore the origins and development of area studies, which I see as rooted in a distinct vision of how to produce and disseminate knowledge about the world, and which would eventually be embodied in a new set of institutions and networks and practices within American higher education, like this one. Within that broader context, my research is focused on the history of U.S. Middle East studies, and I'm particularly interested in reconstructing the elaboration of what I've termed the field's infrastructure, the establishment of new academic institutions and programs, the provision of funding for new modes of research and training, the development of language training methods, materials, and programs, and of library and bibliographic resources, the kinds of things we tend to take for granted, but that somebody actually went about bringing into existence, and the launching of new academic organizations and networks, scholarly journals, and models of graduate education. So put it a little differently, my focus in this project is on field building. I try to narrate what I see as neglected dimensions of the construction and trajectory of Middle East studies as an academic field, while situating that history in relation to the rise of area studies as a whole, to some of the transformations experienced by American higher education since the end of the Second World War, and to developments in American society and politics, including, of course, the rise of the American national security state during the Cold War. I'll come back a little later to that last issue, that the relationship between area studies and the national security state and the forms of knowledge associated with it. In this work, I do not actually devote a great deal of attention to what scholars actually produced in terms of books, articles, conference papers, and so on, or to the theoretical paradigms and methodological presuppositions that inform their work, or to how scholarly expertise on the Middle East related to policymaking. And I made that choice for several reasons. For one, I've already written about that dimension of the field's history at some length and did not feel the need to say any more about it, or maybe I just have nothing else to say about it. But also my priorities in this project lie elsewhere. I'm trying to get at some of the broader visions and rationales that underpin the development of area studies as a purportedly new and better way to understand the world outside the United States, and of pursuing research, graduate training, and undergraduate education. And within that broader context, I'm trying to look at the specific visions and mechanics and logistics of field building in U.S. Middle East studies, as well as the dilemmas and anxieties that often accompanied them. So I have spent a lot of time looking at the for example, the behind-the-scenes decision-making and discussions at the big foundations which led to the grants which funded the new Middle East Studies centers, programs, and departments starting in the late 1940s. I discussed the work, which I argue was not always very successful or effective, and I'll get into that, of the bodies that were set up to promote and lead the development of this field and of the other area studies fields, and the sense of mission that informed but also often hampered that work. And I look into the projects, programs, networks, institutions, organizations spawned in the field building process, including the formation and early history of the Middle East Studies Association. Along the way, I take a closer look at what went on at several university-based Middle East Studies program, not UC Berkeley, but a number of others. We can talk about some of those if there's any interest later on. I'll say one last thing about the big picture, which relates to what I actually don't spend much time on. My main focus is really on the US national scale. So Canada, I largely ignore. It has its own specific histories. I also ignore, for example, the Middle East Institute in Washington, which played from the mid-1940s an important quasi-academic role in the field early on and merits some serious study of its own. I also certainly realize that much of the crucial field building in US Middle East studies was not accomplished by the big foundations or by the academic organizations they funded or by MESA. It was accomplished at colleges and universities across the country, where in each case a small number of highly motivated and energetic scholars and teachers struggled to get languages and survey courses taught, battled departments to allocate faculty lines, trained and mentored students, labored to convince colleagues and administrators to support the creation of Middle East department centers and programs, secure Title VI funding, and so on. These struggles, as some of you know all too well, continue today. Some of you here spend a lot of time engaged on them. This is clearly an important part of the story. The work to recover these local histories, which would complement the perspective I offer here, remains to be done in large part. It'd be really nice to have a spate of master's theses on the history of specific Middle East centers and programs and departments based on work in local archives, interviews, and so on. Until that happens, we're simply going to lack big, important pieces of the story. So with that as background, I'd like to lay out a few of the broader arguments that I think I can make on the basis of this research. And again, I hope that your comments will help me sharpen or clarify those arguments. I'll begin with the question of the origins of area studies. In most accounts, including my own and contending visions, It's the Second World War which is usually described as the midwife of area studies. There's, for example, the often quoted passage from a 1963 speech by McGeorge Bundy, Harvard wunderkind, National Security Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and a key architect of U.S. military intervention in Vietnam. Bundy declared the following to his audience at the School of Advanced International Studies. It's a curious fact of academic history that the first great center of area studies in the United States was not located in any university, but in Washington during the Second World War in the Office of Strategic Services. In very large measure, the area study programs developed in American universities in the years after the war were manned, directed, or stimulated by graduates of the OSS, a remarkable institution, half cops and robbers and half faculty meeting. So the OSS, as some of you may know, was the country's first civilian intelligence agency. It was formally established by President Roosevelt in 1942 and recruited heavily among faculty and graduate students knowledgeable about parts of the world in which the United States was or soon would be deeply engaged. Now, Bundy was not wrong to highlight the importance of the OSS in helping to spawn area studies as a distinctive component of the post-war academic scene. And I think he was also correct to point out that into the 1960s, many of the key figures in most of the area studies fields, including Middle East studies, had served in the OSS. But I argue that the vision of organizing the production and dissemination of knowledge along geographic rather than disciplinary lines had important pre-war roots as well, and that wartime sites and practices outside the OSS also contributed to its emergence. So for one, I think the vision at the heart of area studies had antecedents stretching back at least to the late 1920s. In the interwar period, the key role here was played by the American Council of Learned Societies. The ACLS, which is still in existence, was founded in 1919 to bring together professional organizations like the American Historical Association, the Modern Language Association, the American Oriental Society, and so on. These disciplinary organizations were themselves the relatively recent product of the reorganization along disciplinary lines of teaching, research, and professional life in American higher education, something that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was the same process that yielded what we think of today as the distinct disciplinary departments. Now, the ACLS was funded largely by the Rockefeller Foundation, which, along with the Carnegie Corporation of New York and a number of other foundations, began after the First World War to play critical roles in shaping research in the humanities and the social sciences in the United States and to influence academic life more broadly. The ACLS was funded and run by people who, broadly speaking, shared the ethos of the progressive movement of the 1920s, progressive with a capital P. They felt the mission of the ACLS was to advance and modernize the humanities in the United States, but they also felt that the humanities could and should play a role in improving society by more effectively elucidating and addressing contemporary problems and issues. In this context, from the late 1920s and through the 1930s, ACLS leaders began channeling foundation funding, mainly from the Rockefeller Foundation, into efforts to promote and modernize research and training focused on the non-Western world, beginning with Chinese studies as early as 1928, but eventually including a range of regionally focused fields, including what was then called Near Eastern studies. So this involved, for example, organizing summer institutes that brought together scholars and students for intensive training on a specific country or region, generally including accelerated language training and intensive courses on history and culture. It also involved new postdoctoral research fellowship programs and support for the development of more effective language training methods and materials, so that what were at the time generally called Oriental languages would be taught as living rather than dead languages, and when possible by native speakers. This is an innovation of the 1930s in many ways. And these efforts would lay the basis for the intensive language training programs established for military personnel during the Second World War, and for the approach to language training that would take shape after the war in the new area studies fields. And we, in a sense, continue to benefit from these efforts today. This period also saw the first efforts to create interdisciplinary graduate programs focused on a particular region. For example, the University of Michigan's program in Oriental Civilizations, established in 1928. I use the term interdisciplinary advisedly here because it was also in the 1920s and 1930s that key foundation and academic leaders came to regard the transcendence of disciplinary boundaries as an important goal and began funding efforts to promote it. This development would also feed into the vision of area studies developed during and after the Second World War. So you have these three elements: a focus on geographic regions rather than disciplines, a heightened interest in the non-Western world, and especially for the so-called post-classical period, and a desire to foster interdisciplinarity, although that wasn't the term necessarily used at the time. These things intersected in the interwar period and underpinned the establishment of a number of new institutions which can be seen as forerunners of, or even as prototypes for, post-war area studies. For example, the Institute of Pacific Relations, founded in 1925 and supported largely by Rockefeller money, played an important role in promoting the study of modern and contemporary Asia. From the late 1940s, this institute would be a key target of the Red Scare, with many on the right blaming the scholars associated with it for losing China and accusing them of being communists or communist sympathizers. This may be more surprising, but another institution that I would suggest can plausibly be seen as a forerunner of area studies is the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, founded in 1919, again with massive amounts of Rockefeller money. As one scholar has put it, the Oriental Institute's founder, the famous Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, envisioned it as, quote, a means by which American Oriental studies would be transformed from what they had been, a primarily linguistic endeavor, identified almost exclusively with ancient civilizations, into a historical discipline in which, and this is a quote from Breasted, art, archaeology, political science, language, literature, and sociology, in short, all of the categories of civilization shall be represented and correlated. 2 decades later, this kind of language, and more broadly, a vision of moving beyond philology to something new and interdisciplinary, would provide a key rationale for area studies. So one of the things I'm trying to argue is that area studies did not emerge ex nihilo during or after the Second World War. It's had some complex antecedents. By 1941, the ACLS had already devoted a great deal of energy to what it saw as modernizing the humanities, and it channeled substantial foundation funding into that effort. And this led to the development of academic fields focused on particular geographic regions, especially outside the West. As a result, fields that could be thought of as Far Eastern studies, Latin American studies, and in a much more rudimentary way, perhaps even Near Eastern studies, began to grow in size and develop a certain coherence and institutional density well before the war. Now, of course, each of these fields had their own specificity. For Near Eastern studies, and we can talk about this more, one of the key chief characteristics was that there was actually a pretty well-developed set of scholars, institutions, materials focusing on the ancient Near East in the United States, right? On biblical studies, of course, the study of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, whereas the study of the Near East in the period since the rise of Islam was quite minimal until early in the 20th century and even for decades after that. Now, these fields didn't necessarily define themselves or function as they would after the war, but they were characterized by important changes which set the stage for what happens later. Now, I'll turn very briefly to the Second World War period. I've already quoted McGeorge Bundy's claim that the OSS was the birthplace of U.S. area studies. What I've said so far, of course, suggests that that claim ignores some significant earlier history. But I don't also think there's been perhaps too much focus on the OSS as such. Wartime exigencies brought into being other important sites, projects, practices, and networks through which the vision of area studies was forged. I can't discuss them all in detail here. I'll say only that taken together, they yielded a new and apparently coherent and efficacious conception of how more useful knowledge about the world might be produced and disseminated, but also eventually an assemblage of new academic programs, institutions, and funding flows. To me, it's striking how early in the war this begins to happen. Within a year or so of Pearl Harbor, Foundation officers and leaders of various academic organizations were already beginning to argue that regionally based knowledge production was the wave of the future. Now, in this process, the Social Science Research Council plays a central role. The SSRC had been founded in 1924 to do for the social sciences more or less what the ACLS was supposed to do for the humanities. Protect and extend the interests of the social science disciplines and promote social science research, especially on contemporary social problems. And like the ACLS, the SSRC was funded mainly by the Rockefeller Foundation, that would also develop strong ties to the Carnegie Corporation. I'd note in this regard that both ACLS and SSRC leaders were in very close and virtually constant contact with foundation officers. Those officers at the foundations held the purse strings, they had the money, but they depended on SSRC and ACLS leaders to come up with fundable projects and then to implement them, working with universities and with scholars. Underpinning and facilitating this close working relationship was the fact that both sets of men, and they were virtually all men, for the most part came from and belonged to the same social world. They tended in the 1930s and on into the 1950s to be from well-to-do families of white Protestant stock. They were often educated at Ivy League institutions and sometimes before that at the same exclusive private schools. And broadly speaking, they shared a common outlook on the world and on their mission in it. That outlook might again be characterized as progressive with a capital P, internationalist in a Wilsonian sense, and propelled by a sort of elite, technocratic, and very American noblesse oblige. This efficient working relationship was enabled by the fact that, to a large extent, these men shared common values and operated within the same sociocultural and mental universe. I'll mention just one manifestation of this. In the course of my archival research, I found that in the later 1940s and into the 1950s, a great many of the conversations between SSRC and Foundation officials during which key programmatic and funding decisions about area studies were made took place over lunch at the Century Club on West 43rd Street in Manhattan, just off Fifth Avenue. This was then a private club where the power elite convened out of earshot, and from which, incidentally, perhaps not so incidentally, women were barred from membership until 1989. Now, early in the war, with Foundation support and guidance, the SSRC began pushing the idea that what now began to be called regional or area or aerial studies, aerial not in the sense of the air, but area with an L at the end, that fortunately died out. These studies offered a new and highly promising approach to research, graduate training, and undergraduate education. Now, there was certainly an instrumental side to this vision. It was understood that after the war, the United States would be a global power. It would therefore need, as a June 1943 assessment of the promise and prospects of area studies put it, thousands of Americans who combine thorough professional or technical training with knowledge of the languages, economics, politics, history, geography, peoples, customs, and religions of foreign countries. But there was more to it than that. Academic leaders also argued, again, from pretty early on in the war, that the reorientation of knowledge production and dissemination along regional lines would benefit the social sciences, both by producing findings with a stronger claim to universality and by fostering something like what would later come to be called interdisciplinarity. So a member of the SSRC staff put it this way in 1944. We have long been aware that the social disciplines have been provincial in their failure to check their experiences against those of cultures not under Western civilization. This kind of checking is very much needed. And he went on to add that a regional focus may be one way of integrating the social sciences, effectively encouraging the interdisciplinary work so long discussed. So this brings me to another of my central arguments, which concerns why this new vision was so quickly translated into funding, institutions, curricula, academic positions, and the like once the war ending. Something like area studies is visibly up and running in many fields, unevenly, of course, some earlier, some later, by the late 1940s. Now, many accounts attribute the rise of area studies largely or exclusively to the Cold War and its association with the national security state that's formed in that process. I tend to think that interpretation is wrong, or at least quite inadequate. For one, as I've noted here, the concept of area studies took shape well before the Cold War. It certainly had something to do with concerns about the role of the United States in the post-war world, and with training scholars, students, and others who'd be better able to make sense of the non-Western world in particular. But I don't think that should lead us to reduce area studies to Cold War form of knowledge, as some have done, and I can name names later on if anyone is interested. As I've already said, academic leaders, foundation officials began to formulate and promote the concept of area studies as early as 1943, right? At a time when no one could have foreseen that the post-war era would be characterized by a decades-long global struggle between camps led by the United States and the Soviet Union. There were certainly scholars, as we're all here aware, in the post-war area studies who sought to produce what would later be termed policy-relevant knowledge. And of course, some of the area studies centers, notably those for Russian and East Asian studies, thrived on contracts from the military and intelligence agencies. But the research pursued by the vast majority of scholars in the post-war area studies fields was not particularly shaped by the needs of the state, as far as I can tell. And eventually, scholars and students in many of these area studies fields would develop radical critiques of their own fields and of what they saw as the complicity of some of those in them with the state. Moreover, the great bulk of area studies centers and of their affiliated faculty was supported not by intelligence or military contracts, but by university and sometimes by foundation funds, later supplemented by Title VI funding. So to make this point is not to diminish the responsibility or diminish the reality of university and foundation complicity with the American national security state during the Cold War and after, or to relieve anyone of political and moral responsibility for their actions. It's simply to insist that we need to be careful about reducing area studies to a Cold War form of knowledge or explaining the field's emergence as an epiphenomenon of the Cold War. At the same time, I'd argue that we need to keep in mind who actually made possible the translation of this concept taking shape already during the war into reality. It was not the United States government. Right? The federal government only begins pumping money directly into area studies after the passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1958. Title VI funding, as it begins to flow in the very late 1950s and onward down to the present, certainly supported the establishment of new area studies centers and the provision of fellowships for graduate training, especially perhaps at inland public universities, which had not benefited from the foundation's largesse. But this new academic field came into existence in the later 1940s and the 1950s, well before the federal government appeared on the scene. It was actually large-scale funding by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, joined in the 1950s by the vastly wealthier Ford Foundation, which launched and sustained area studies in the United States well before the federal government got into the act. The Ford Foundation alone spent something like $250 million on area and international studies, very broadly defined, between 1953 and 1968. And it was foundation officials at Carnegie and Rockefeller, in collaboration with SSRC and to a lesser extent ACLS leaders, who formulated the vision underpinning area studies and made it happen across the full range of regional fields. These foundation officials, who worked closely with the SSRC's Committee on World Area Research, made the key decisions and allocated the funding. So, for example, it was John Gardner, who was at the time a young member of the Carnegie Corporation staff, but would later become the corporation's president, and then Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the 1960s, and as such an architect of the Great Society programs, who in the spring of 1947 traveled around the country visiting universities to determine which ones should receive Carnegie funding for area studies centers in which fields. As a result, by 1958, a ramified network of area studies centers had already been established at universities across the country, along with a national research fellowship program and other key components of what would be recognizable as area studies. Now, in the process, foundation officers and academic leaders grappled with the question of what area studies should be, what this new field should be. And early on, there were multiple conflicting visions. For example, the ACLS saw area studies really from the 1930s into the 1950s primarily as a way to enhance language training and to give undergraduates a better understanding of the world, especially the non-Western world. In contrast, the SSRC, with support mainly from Carnegie, saw social science research and graduate training as the top priorities. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the SSRC regarded area studies as complementary to the disciplines, as a way to compel the social science disciplines in the United States to deal with the wider world, overcome the boundaries between them, and question their claims to universality, which were implicitly based on treating certain Western paths of development as the universal norm. By the early 1950s, the SSRC's vision had emerged as the dominant one for various reasons, and with backing from the foundations, especially Ford as it got into the act and took precedence in this field in the 1950s, it was the SSRC which oversaw the development of area studies from that point on. Still, defining precisely what area studies should be, what it should seek to do, remained a very fraught question, which troubled the founders of this field in the late 40s and early 50s. This question generated a great deal of anxiety, which would plague many of the area studies fields, including Middle East studies, for decades to come. The key figures in this nascent area studies field grappled with this question. They were convinced that, like each of the disciplines, area studies needed something like a theory and method of its own, something that would give it intellectual coherence and inform the research agenda of these emerging, regionally focused academic fields. And they struggled mightily to figure out what that might be. Now, early on, their search for a method led them to look to several current research projects that they hoped could serve as possible models for the new field that would yield that might yield a conceptual and methodological paradigm suitable for area studies. So, for example, at the very first national conference that brought together leading figures in all the new area studies fields held at Columbia in November 1947, there was a lot of excited discussion of the Puerto Rico Social Anthropology Project, what the anthropologists here may be familiar with. This was an in-depth study which was just getting underway of the population of Puerto Rico, especially its rural majority. It was presided over by Julian Stewart, who then was head of Columbia's Department of Anthropology. Today is probably best remembered for formulating the concept of cultural ecology. But actual field work in Puerto Rico was carried out mainly by several of Stewart's graduate students, the best known of whom were Sidney Mintz and Eric Wolf. At the time, this was regarded as cutting-edge research. Most anthropological studies had tended to focus on small communities, right, villages, tribal groups, and the like, and often treated them as self-contained, isolated units. In contrast, the Puerto Rico project tried to look at Puerto Rican rural society as a whole, with the aim of gauging the impact of industrialization on rural communities through oral history, labor studies, and comparative surveys of sociocultural patterns. The kinds of theoretical and methodological problems with which Julian Stewart was grappling in Puerto Rico seemed to the founders of area studies at that moment the very problems which area studies writ large had to face. Hence their hope that Stewart's work in Puerto Rico, which involved in-depth research on a geographically defined space, might blaze a trail for this new field in formation. It gradually became clear that neither this project nor other similar projects touted as possible models really offered suitable models for regionally focused research. And by the early 1950s, most of the social sciences who had played key roles early on in elaborating area studies had in practice largely given up on coming up with a theory and a method for the new field, some generalizable model that practitioners could deploy. Moreover, many of the scholars and students in these new area studies fields, in fact, already operated as if area studies was whatever they happened to be doing. They did not feel much urgent need for a coherent paradigm for area studies as such, a clear definition of its object and methodology. Nonetheless, the question of the proper relationship between area studies and the disciplines would continue to vex leaders in the field for decades to come. And that quest for some coherent paradigm for area studies that could guide its research agenda did not really come to an end. It simply devolved from being framed as an issue for area studies as a whole to being framed as a problem for each separate regional field that were to be grappled with within each field. Both of these issues would confront or even haunt the various committees that the SSRC began to establish from the late 1940s to promote and lead the development of each particular area studies field. These committees were initially funded by the Carnegie Corporation and then later by Ford, which remained the dominant force in terms of funding and programming for area studies down to the mid-1990s. I've devoted a lot of time and energy to reconstructing the deliberations and activities of one of those regional committees, the SSRC's Committee for the Near and Middle East, established in 1951, and from 1959 onward, jointly sponsored with the ACLS. Because I think we can learn a lot about how Middle East studies as a field was actually built from a close-up look at what this committee tried to do over its 45-year lifespan, how it tried to do it, and what its shifting roster of members, most of them leading scholars in the field, thought they were doing and why. Now, I fully realize that reconstructing the work of an academic committee probably sounds like the most boring, if not coma-inducing thing that many of you can imagine. And I'll confess that I sometimes had trouble staying awake while poring over the minutes of this committee's meetings day after week, year after year, decade after decade. But many of us here know how academic life works. We've had to sit through seemingly endless committee meetings, usually deadly tedious, but sometimes actually productive. In any case, this is where important decisions in academia often get made or not made with real consequences. This is in one way we can see how the sausage of field building actually gets made, so to speak. It's also the case that my own personal experience led me to devote a lot of effort to reconstructing what this committee in its various incarnations was up to. From 1991 to 1995, relatively early in my own academic career, I served on this same SSRC ACLS Joint Committee on the Near and Middle East, a very long title. The whole question of why it was called Near and Middle East, that's another question we can talk about. So I served on this committee for 4 years. We didn't know it at the time, but this was almost at the end of the lifespan of this committee, because in 1996, in the name of globalization, the SSRC disbanded all its regional committees and substituted a whole new structure. We can talk more about that later on. So what did we actually do on this committee? Well, as far as I can recall, the main thing we did, and certainly the most enjoyable, was to award dissertation research fellowships funded by the Ford Foundation to smart graduate students, which certainly helped advance the field. They went off and did their research and did good stuff. We also had many really excellent meals in wonderful places. For some reason, the SSRC deemed it imperative that we convene in Rabat or Lyon or Buyukada for the weekend, as far as I could tell, mainly to eat. It's the only time in my life I felt like a jet setter. But I do have vivid memories as well of witnessing from my perch at the sort of bottom of the social hierarchy on this committee the anxiety that beset the senior scholars who led the committee when it came to fulfilling what they took to be the committee's other main mission, framing a research agenda that would move U.S. Middle East studies forward. They had great difficulty doing what they felt they'd been mandated to do, coming up with and implementing a cutting-edge research program for the field. This led to a great deal of anxiety and to a sense of failure and self-doubt. Decades later, there I am in the archives, and I'm struck to find that the same anxiety seems to have plagued the same committee virtually from its inception in 1951. Come back to that in a moment. Now, this committee from its inception had a number of tasks. It was supposed to award a number of postdoctoral research fellowships, as I said, and later doctoral dissertation research fellowships. It was supposed to help develop what I've called the infrastructure of Middle East studies. And it was charged with formulating and implementing a research agenda, as I've said, determining priorities that reflected some vision of the field and its needs, some concept of what it was and where it should go. This committee was, I'd argue, much more successful at the first two of those missions than at the third. The postdoctoral, I've mentioned the research grants, right, first postdoctoral, then from the 1970s, dissertation research grants. Fine. One assumes it handed them out in some reasonable way for useful purposes for the field. Meanwhile, the committee's role in developing the field's infrastructure took up a lot of its energy. And it took on tasks for the field as a whole, which in the absence of the Middle East Studies Association or any other national body, there was no one else to do. So, for example, it played a key role in launching the Inter-University Consortium, still around today, that began to offer intensive summer training courses in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. It supported the development of new teaching methods and materials for Middle Eastern languages. Those of you who have studied Arabic will know how important this is. It subsidized the translation into English of Hans Wehr's Dictionary of Modern Arabic. Otherwise, we'd have had to learn German first. It helped finalize the Library of Congress transliteration system for Arabic. It helped launch CASA, the Center for Arabic Study Abroad, based, well, more or less these days in Cairo. And last but not least, in 1966, this committee played a central role in establishing the Middle East Studies Association. It's no coincidence that the chair of that committee at the time, Mauro Berger, the sociologist, became MESA's first president. In short, this committee played a critical role in getting U.S. Middle East studies as a nationwide academic field up and running. But what of the committee's mission to formulate and implement a coherent research agenda for Middle East studies, to determine where the cutting edge of the field was and push it forward in keeping with, again, some sense of some coherent idea of what the field should be about, which means some theory, some paradigm. This was a task in which the committee, from its inception to its dismantling, doesn't seem to have been very successful at fulfilling. And this lack of success generated a lot of anxiety and a widespread sense of inferiority among even leading scholars in the field about their field, a sense that Middle East studies was intellectually backward, not up to speed with the other area studies fields and with the disciplines. And they always had one eye on the disciplines, which were taken as the model. Again, they have their coherent methods, they have their paradigms, they're doing just great, supposedly, and here we are, unsuccessful. Let me illustrate this with some quotes from the archives. So here, for example, is the very first chair of the SSRC Committee on the Near and Middle East addressing his fellow committee members 2 years after the committee was established, so we're September 1953. Have we any more reason for existence? Have we as a group shot our bolt, contributed all we can to the development of Near Eastern research in America, and are content and remain content to carry on through our own individual work, teaching, and contacts? If so, let's disband, or have the SSRC disband us. If not, where do we go now? Frankly, I have a guilt complex. I am unhappy with how little we have accomplished. A year later, frankly, I see no reason for our existence unless we as a group endeavor somehow and immediately to inventory that basic research which must be done and somehow run the risk of determining priorities. Here in the early 60s, another committee member summing up a discussion that's taken place. One member summed up his impression of the discussion, saying that while the Joint Committee has accomplished a good deal in the past in the services it had performed and projects it had undertaken, it appeared to him that the Joint Committee had no very clear idea of what it might do in the future other than administer the grants program. February 1968, a leading political scientist serving on the committee. I am particularly struck by the dearth of new talent coming into the field, while very gifted graduate students have been entering the various disciplines of African studies in large numbers in recent years. Things are always good somewhere else in this perspective. The Ford Foundation would like the SSRC to exert some positive leadership rather than just passively distributing funds to individuals who come forward. 1970, it is time the committee stopped berating itself for its failures. While it may be the case that the Middle East field as a whole has shown less intellectual vitality than is true for other area fields, I believe there are a variety of objective reasons to explain these shortcomings. We are in that converse dilemma where self-censor and self-pity paralyzes resolve, devalues all undertakings as insufficient or irrelevant, and contributes to a self-perpetuating fantasy of incompetence. And then finally, and I could come up with many other quotes. This is from 1980, after one of an endless series of state-of-the-art, state-of-the-field discussions, workshops, conferences, on and on, lots of anxiety. The SSRC staff person for this committee, in his handwritten notes on this meeting, says, dilemma, ineffectiveness of 20 years of work from an area studies approach in producing quality research. So what's going on here? For decades, committee members, especially the social scientists among them, and especially the political scientists, I think, found themselves stuck. They'd been appointed this committee in large part to fulfill the SSRC's mandate to formulate and implement a research agenda for Middle East studies. Over their shoulders loomed the disciplines, each of which seemed to be neatly and happily organized around the investigation of some coherent object, society, culture, whatever, the political system. Moreover, they're convinced that their disciplinary colleagues were making wondrous progress, right? The political scientists are looking at their colleagues who are elaborating modernization theory, right? And the behavioral turn in political science, tremendous success, or so it looks until it falls apart in the 1970s. So by comparison, what are they doing? Into the 1980s, they pretty much hold fast to the belief that somewhere out there, just over the horizon, there's this useful interdisciplinary paradigm for their own field that would be found to inform the research agenda they're supposed to develop. Yet that paradigm always remains elusive, despite endless workshops and conferences, as I said, on the state of the field, which they hoped would achieve a breakthrough to something like the theory and method of area studies that the founders of area studies had envisioned 3 decades earlier. Of course, this never happens. The committee, in fact, never fulfills its mission of developing a coherent, much less interdisciplinary research agenda for Middle East studies rooted in some clearly defined theoretical paradigm. In fact, by the 1980s, this whole quest increasingly comes to seem not only unattainable, but fundamentally misguided. I don't have the time to go into detail, but so I'll say only that in the long 1980s, Middle East studies, like many other academic fields, was profoundly altered by the transformations sweeping the humanities and to extent the social sciences. The impact of feminist theory and of women's and then gender studies, the encounter with post-structuralism, the linguistic or cultural turn, the rise of new fields or fields new to American academia, such as post-colonial studies and cultural studies, and changing demographics within the field, within all the area studies fields. All these things powerfully affected the intellectual landscape of the area studies fields, but they also affect the landscape of the disciplines, right? As people question increasingly the coherence of what each discipline had traditionally specified as its object and the boundaries between them. So if the coherence of the disciplines was put into question, what plausible basis is there for insisting that an area studies field have some coherent object and a corresponding methodology? And these questions add on to the impact already underway of the critiques of Orientalism and modernization theory and so on, and interact with them. So the upshot of all this is a reconfiguration of I love the musical accompaniment. I should sing the rest, I guess. No, I'll refrain. The upshot of all this is a reconfiguration of what had long been seen as the troubled relationship between the disciplines and area studies, along with the sprouting of all sorts of new versions of interdisciplinarity. But another consequence was the fading away of the expectation that Middle East studies and the other area studies fields, or area studies in general, could or should or would produce a theory and a method that would specify its parameters and shape its practice. In reality, this had always been mission impossible. This had always been like herding cats. And this vision dissipated, and in its place came growing recognition, de facto at least, that what gives Middle East studies such coherence as it possesses is essentially the fact that those engaged in it, while doing a great many different things in intellectual terms, all relate to more or less the same region of the world and are engaged with a common set of institutions and networks, departments, centers, and programs locally on the national level, the Middle East Studies Association, academic journals, networks, fellowship programs, on and on, language training programs, so that the field, like all fields in a sense, like disciplines in a sense, has a heavily institutional and perhaps social rather than a strictly intellectual basis. And these developments, I think, helped set the stage for what I take to be the intellectual flourishing of Middle East studies in the last several decades, and also helped the field free itself from that chronic sense of intellectual backwardness, exceptionalism, and inferiority and isolation that had once been so widespread. So the upshot has been people producing a lot of excellent work that's both disciplinarily grounded, whatever that means today, since the disciplines have long ago been put into question, but also happily interdisciplinary, and that are no longer isolated from intellectual currents and debates across a range of fields. In his memoirs, the eminent China scholar John K. Fairbank offered this perspective on area studies from the 1940s into the 1980s. For a time, there was a mystique attached to area studies, an assumption that a combining of disciplines would somehow produce a super discipline, a new intellectual grasp. In the end, one had to agree area study was not a new discipline of organized principles, it was only an activity, something one did. In my work, I've been trying to get at the visions that shaped area studies and Middle East studies, where they came from, that idea of area studies as offering a new intellectual grasp, as Fairbank put it. But I'm also trying to get at least some of that something one did, what it actually meant in practice, which turned out to be rather different from those early visions. There's, of course, much more to say about all of these things and much more to the story than I've been able to get to. But as I see it, the historical trajectory of Middle East studies in this country, and this is very much an American story, we can talk more about that, has been replete with unintended and unanticipated consequences, unrealized aspirations, and persistent anxieties. At the same time, the outcome, thus far at least, has been the construction of an apparently durable academic field that has established itself in American higher education, and that is proven to be of some value to the world of scholarship and to society. And it's also a field that I will conclude by suggesting is worth defending against those who would dismantle it to achieve their political agenda. Thank you.